The coffee was still warm when they found Harold Mitchell's truck. Steam rose from the thermos sitting on the dashboard, its metal surface catching the pale October sunlight that filtered through the windshield of the idling Ford pickup. The engine hummed steadily, keys dangling from the ignition, driver's door hanging wide open like Harold had simply stepped out for a moment to check something in the cornfield. But Harold Mitchell was nowhere to be found. It was 9:47 a.m. on October 15, 1992, when neighbor Tom Bradley spotted the abandoned vehicle from his own property line. The sight struck him as wrong immediately. Harold wasn't the type to leave his truck running, wasn't careless with fuel or machinery. In 32 years of farming adjacent plots in Grain County, Kansas, Tom had never seen Harold waste so much as a drop of gasoline. Something wasn't right. And that something sent a chill down Tom's spine that had nothing to do with the crisp autumn air. The truck sat roughly 50 yards into Harold's cornfield, positioned between two rows as if he'd been driving through to inspect his crop. The corn stalks stood tall and brown around the vehicle, their dried leaves rustling in the morning breeze with a sound like whispered secrets. Harold's work gloves lay on the passenger seat, and his thermos of coffee, black, no sugar, the way Martha had been making it for him for 28 years, sat untouched and steaming on the dash. Tom called out Harold's name, his voice carrying across the empty field. Nothing answered back except the wind through the corn and the distant lowing of cattle. He walked the perimeter of the truck, looking for footprints in the soft earth, but the ground was hard-packed from weeks without rain, offering no clues about which direction Harold might have gone. When Tom finally worked up the courage to approach the vehicle, he noticed Harold's wallet sitting on the bench seat, bills visible through the worn leather. His reading glasses were folded neatly beside it. The radio was tuned to the local AM station, playing a Conway Twitty song that Harold probably hadn't heard the end of. Everything suggested a man who'd intended to return in moments, not disappear forever. By the time Sheriff Robert Clark arrived at the scene, word had already begun to spread through the tight-knit community of Millerville. The sheriff was a methodical man, used to dealing with lost cattle and domestic disputes, not missing persons. He documented the scene with a borrowed Polaroid camera, each flash preserving the strange tableau of abandonment. The truck's odometer showed Harold had driven exactly 2.3 miles that morning, the distance from his farmhouse to this spot in the field. Clark interviewed Tom Bradley on the spot, writing notes in his small spiral notebook with careful precision. Tom explained that he'd been fixing fence posts when he noticed the truck, that the timing seemed wrong because Harold typically worked his fields earlier in the morning. He mentioned the coffee, still steaming, and how Harold's favorite John Deere cap wasn't in its usual spot hanging from the rearview mirror. The sheriff searched the immediate area, walking in expanding circles from the truck, calling Harold's name every few steps. The corn had been ready for harvest, standing over 6 feet tall in most places, creating a maze of golden corridors that seemed to swallow sound. Clark noted the absence of any signs of struggle, any blood, any indication of what might have happened to a man who'd simply vanished from the middle of his own land. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the cornfield, Sheriff Clark made the decision to call in additional help. What had started as a simple welfare check was becoming something much more serious. Harold Mitchell, a man as predictable as the Kansas seasons themselves, had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only questions and the haunting image of that still-running truck in the middle of nowhere. Harold Mitchell was the kind of man small towns are built around, steady, reliable, and woven so deeply into the fabric of Millerville that his absence felt like a tear in the community itself. At 54, he possessed the weathered hands and sun-creased face that spoke of 3 decades working the same 640 acres his father had left him. His neighbors knew they could set their clocks by Harold's routines: morning chores at dawn, coffee at the kitchen table cafe every Tuesday, and church every Sunday in the 3rd pew from the front right side. Martha Mitchell had been Harold's anchor for 28 years, ever since they'd married in the small white church that sat at Millerville's heart. She was a schoolteacher at the elementary school, known for her gentle patience with struggling readers and her prize-winning apple pie at the county fair. Together, they'd raised 2 children, Michael, now 30 and working as an engineer in Topeka, and Sarah, 26, and teaching at a school in Kansas City. The Mitchell family represented everything solid and good about rural American life. Harold's disappearance shattered that image like a stone through glass. Martha had kissed him goodbye that morning at 6:15 a.m., watching from the kitchen window as he climbed into his truck and headed toward the back 40. She'd waved, and he'd waved back, a ritual they'd performed thousands of times over the decades. She expected him home for lunch at noon, expected to hear his boots on the porch steps, expected the comfortable rhythm of their life to continue unchanged. When noon came and went without Harold, Martha felt the first flutter of unease in her chest. By 1 p.m., that flutter had become a knot of worry. Harold was punctual to a fault, religious about meal times and keeping schedules. She called Tom Bradley, thinking perhaps Harold had stopped by to discuss the irrigation system they'd been planning. Tom's voice over the phone carried a weight that made Martha's hands shake as she gripped the receiver. The Mitchell farmhouse, built in 1923 by Harold's grandfather, had never felt empty before. Now, as Martha sat at the kitchen table waiting for news, every creak of the old wood floors seemed to echo with Harold's absence. The coffee pot held enough for 2 cups, the way she'd made it every morning for years. Harold's reading glasses sat on the table beside yesterday's newspaper, still folded to the commodity prices page. Friends and neighbors began arriving as word spread through Millerville's tight network of relationships. Dorothy Coleman from the post office brought casseroles. Jim Peters from the grain elevator offered to help with evening chores. The kitchen filled with worried voices and the kind of hushed conversations that accompany tragedy. Everyone had theories, but none of them made sense when applied to Harold Mitchell. Harold didn't drink beyond an occasional beer at church socials. He didn't gamble, didn't owe money, didn't have enemies. His medical checkup 3 months earlier had shown him to be in excellent health for his age. The farm was profitable. The mortgage nearly paid off. His relationship with Martha was solid, built on decades of shared purpose and genuine affection. Their children called regularly and visited often. There was simply no logical reason for Harold to walk away from his life. Sheriff Clark arrived at the farmhouse near sunset, his expression grave as he explained what they'd found. Or rather, what they hadn't found. He asked Martha about Harold's state of mind, about any changes in behavior, about possible enemies or financial troubles. Martha answered each question with growing bewilderment. Harold had been himself that morning, quiet, focused, looking forward to getting the corn harvested before the weather turned. As darkness fell over Millerville, Martha Mitchell faced her first night alone in 28 years of marriage. The house that had sheltered 3 generations of Mitchells now felt like a monument to questions without answers. Somewhere out there, beyond the yellow glow of the porch light Harold had installed last spring, lay the mystery of what had happened to a man whose life had been an open book to everyone who knew him. The perfect life Harold and Martha had built together had been interrupted by something unthinkable, leaving behind only silence and the terrible uncertainty of not knowing whether the man she loved was in danger, injured, or worse. Dawn broke grey and cold over Millerville on October 16, 1992, marking the beginning of what would become the largest search operation in Greene County's history. Sheriff Robert Clark had spent a sleepless night making phone calls, coordinating with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, and trying to wrap his mind around the impossibility of Harold Mitchell's disappearance. By 7 a.m., volunteer searchers began gathering at the Mitchell farm, their breath visible in the crisp morning air as they huddled around folding tables laden with thermos bottles and hastily drawn maps. The Greene County Sheriff's Department consisted of Clark and 2 deputies, hardly equipped for a missing person investigation of this magnitude. But Millerville's 847 residents rallied with the kind of determination that defined small-town America. Farmers postponed harvest schedules, shop owners closed early, and Martha's fellow teachers arranged substitute coverage to join the search. Even teenagers from the high school showed up after classes, their young faces serious with the weight of adult responsibility thrust upon them. Clark divided the searchers into teams, assigning each group a section of Harold's 640 acres. The property stretched from Highway 34 in the north to Willow Creek in the south, encompassing rolling fields of corn and wheat, pasture land dotted with cattle, and a small woodlot where Harold cut firewood each winter. The terrain appeared deceptively simple from a distance, but up close revealed countless places where a man could fall, hide, or be hidden. The bloodhounds arrived from Topeka just after noon. Two German shepherds named Rex and Duke, whose handler, Sergeant Maria Gonzalez, had worked dozens of missing person cases across Kansas. She started the dogs at Harold's truck, watching as they sniffed the driver's seat, the steering wheel, and Harold's work gloves. Rex picked up the scent immediately, his nose to the ground, as he traced an invisible trail through the cornfield toward the southern boundary of the property. The trail led directly to Willow Creek, a meandering waterway that had carved its path through the Kansas prairie for centuries. The creek ran year-round, fed by underground springs and seasonal rainfall, its banks thick with cottonwood trees and wild brush. Rex and Duke both lost the scent at the water's edge, circling frantically along the muddy bank before sitting back on their haunches in the universal canine signal of defeat. Sergeant Gonzalez waded into the creek herself, probing the murky water with a long metal rod, searching for any sign that Harold might have fallen in. The water was only waist-deep at its deepest point, running clear over a sandy bottom. She found nothing. No clothing, no body, no indication that Harold had ever entered the water. The scent trail simply ended at the creek's edge, as if Harold had vanished into thin air. As daylight faded on the first full day of searching, the volunteers gathered back at the farmhouse to report their findings. Tom Bradley's team had covered the eastern fields, finding nothing but Harold's cattle grazing peacefully in their pasture. The high school boys had searched the woodlot, climbing trees and checking every fallen log large enough to conceal a body. Dorothy Coleman's group had walked every fence line, looking for signs of struggle or disturbance. All reported the same result: nothing. Sheriff Clark stood on Martha's front porch as the searchers dispersed, their flashlight beams bobbing across the darkening landscape like fireflies. The investigation had consumed 48 hours and produced exactly 0 leads. Harold Mitchell remained as missing as the moment Tom Bradley first spotted his abandoned truck. The bloodhounds had given them their only concrete clue. Harold had walked from his truck to Willow Creek under his own power, but even that knowledge only deepened the mystery. Inside the farmhouse, Martha Mitchell sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by the debris of community support, empty casserole dishes, crumpled paper cups, and the phone numbers of dozens of volunteers who'd promised to continue searching. The house felt different now, marked by the presence of strangers and the absence of the one person who mattered most. Outside, Harold's truck sat in the yard where the tow truck had delivered it, looking ordinary and innocent, keeping its secrets locked away behind that still warm thermos of coffee. The details emerged slowly, like developing photographs in the red glow of a darkroom, each revelation adding depth to the mystery that had consumed Millerville. 3 days after Harold's disappearance, Sheriff Clark began the painstaking process of reconstructing October 15, 1992, minute by minute, searching for any deviation from Harold Mitchell's predictable routine that might explain the inexplicable. Martha provided the foundation of Harold's final morning. He'd risen at 5:30 a.m., exactly as he had every day for the past 30 years. Black coffee and toast with strawberry preserves, Martha's homemade preserves from berries they'd picked together last June. Harold had mentioned wanting to check the moisture content in the back 40 before deciding whether to start harvest the following week. Nothing unusual in his demeanor, no hint of distress or preoccupation. He'd kissed her goodbye at 6:15 a.m. and driven away into what would become his last day. But Clark's investigation revealed cracks in the ordinary facade. The first came from Harold's phone records, which showed an incoming call at 9:23 p.m. on October 14th, the night before his disappearance. The call had lasted exactly 14 minutes, originating from a payphone at the truck stop 30 miles west on Interstate 70. Martha remembered Harold taking the call in his study, closing the door behind him, which struck her as odd since Harold typically took calls in the kitchen while she worked on lesson plans nearby. When Clark pressed Martha about the call, she admitted that Harold had seemed different afterward, quieter than usual, distracted during their evening ritual of watching the 10 o'clock news together. He'd gone to bed without saying much, and when Martha asked if everything was all right, Harold had simply nodded and said it was probably nothing. Those two words haunted Martha now. Probably nothing had become everything. Tom Bradley provided another piece of the puzzle during his second interview with Sheriff Clark. Tom revealed that Harold's cattle had been in the wrong pasture that morning, something so unusual that Tom had almost mentioned it when he first discovered the abandoned truck. Harold was meticulous about rotation schedules, moving his cattle between 3 different pastures according to a system his father had taught him. Finding the herd in the south pasture instead of the west one was like finding Harold's truck running in reverse. The cattle detail led Clark to interview Pete Morrison, Harold's closest neighbor to the south. Pete's property bordered Willow Creek, and his bedroom window offered a clear view of Harold's back 40. Pete mentioned seeing vehicle headlights on Harold's property around 2 a.m. on October 15th. Hours before Harold typically began his morning routine, Pete had assumed it was Harold himself, perhaps checking on a sick animal, but now the timing seemed significant. More whispers surfaced as Clark expanded his interviews throughout Grain County. Sally Weber at the post office remembered Harold seeming preoccupied when he'd picked up his mail 3 days before disappearing. Instead of his usual friendly conversation about weather and crops, Harold had simply nodded and left quickly. Jim Peters at the grain elevator recalled Harold asking unusual questions about crop insurance policies and land values, conversations that struck Jim as odd since Harold's financial situation appeared solid. The most disturbing detail came from Harold's own daughter, Sarah, during a tearful phone interview from Kansas City. Sarah revealed that Harold had called her on October 12th, 3 days before his disappearance, asking questions about her brother Michael's work schedule in Topeka. Harold had wanted to know if Michael was traveling for his engineering job when he'd be home, and whether he'd mentioned any problems to Sarah. The questions had puzzled Sarah because Harold typically spoke directly to Michael about such matters. Sheriff Clark began mapping these seemingly unconnected details on a timeline, searching for patterns in the fragments of Harold's final weeks. The phone call from the truck stop payphone, the cattle in the wrong pasture, the mysterious vehicle lights at 2 a.m., Harold's uncharacteristic questions about his children's schedules and his own insurance policies. Each detail seemed insignificant alone, but together they painted a picture of a man dealing with something that had disrupted his carefully ordered world. The investigation had expanded beyond a simple missing person case into something more complex and troubling. Harold Mitchell hadn't simply vanished. He'd been wrestling with something in the days leading up to October 15th, something significant enough to change his behavior in subtle but detectable ways. The question that kept Sheriff Clark awake at night was whether Harold had been planning something or whether someone else had been planning something for Harold. In the growing pile of interview notes and evidence bags that cluttered Clark's desk, the truth remained elusive, hidden somewhere in the spaces between what people remembered and what they'd chosen to forget. The weeks following Harold's disappearance transformed the Mitchell farmhouse into a shrine of suspended time. Martha found herself unable to move Harold's reading glasses from their spot beside the kitchen table, unable to wash the coffee cup he'd used on his final morning, unable to accept that the man who'd shared her bed for 28 years might never return to explain what had happened in those cornfields. The house that had once echoed with the comfortable rhythms of married life now held only the hollow sound of Martha's footsteps and the persistent ticking of the grandfather clock Harold's father had built in 1947. Michael arrived from Topeka within hours of learning about his father's disappearance, his engineer's mind immediately trying to construct logical explanations for an illogical situation. He spent days walking the property with a surveyor's precision, measuring distances from the abandoned truck to various landmarks, calculating how far a man could walk in the time between Harold's departure from the house and Tom Bradley's discovery of the vehicle. Michael's methodical approach provided a temporary refuge from the emotional chaos, but it yielded no answers, only more questions that mathematics couldn't solve. Sarah drove down from Kansas City every weekend for months, bringing her teaching experience to bear on the investigation by creating detailed timelines and organizing the scattered information Sheriff Clark had gathered. She interviewed neighbors, traced phone records, and maintained correspondence with missing person organizations across 3 states. Sarah's determination was both admirable and heartbreaking to witness, a young woman refusing to accept that some questions simply couldn't be answered through persistence and careful organization. The children's vigil took different forms, but shared the same desperate core. Michael installed motion sensor lights around the farmhouse perimeter and a new security system that would alert Martha to any movement on the property. He changed his work schedule to visit every other week, telling his supervisor that family obligations required his attention. Sarah established a reward fund and convinced the Kansas City newspaper to run periodic stories about Harold's case, hoping to keep public attention focused on their father's disappearance. Martha's grief manifested in more subtle but equally devastating ways. She continued setting 2 places at the dinner table for months after Harold vanished, only catching herself when the food had grown cold on the unused plate. She maintained Harold's side of the bed with military precision, washing and changing his pillowcase weekly, as if preparing for his return. The elementary school where she taught granted her extended leave after colleagues noticed her inability to concentrate on lesson plans and her tendency to stare out classroom windows toward the distant cornfields where Harold had last been seen. The community's initial outpouring of support gradually diminished as autumn turned to winter and winter gave way to spring. Casseroles stopped appearing on the front porch. Phone calls became less frequent. The search volunteers returned to their own lives and their own problems, leaving the Mitchell family isolated in their grief. Millerville, like most small towns, possessed a finite capacity for sustained tragedy. Life demanded forward movement, and Harold's disappearance had become an uncomfortable reminder that terrible things could happen to good people without explanation or resolution. By the first anniversary of Harold's disappearance, Martha had lost 30 pounds and developed a tremor in her hands that made grading papers difficult. Michael's marriage showed signs of strain as his wife struggled to understand his obsession with solving his father's case. Sarah had taken a leave of absence from teaching to dedicate herself full-time to the investigation, a decision that worried her family and friends, but felt like the only meaningful action she could take. The worst moments came during harvest season, when the sound of distant combines working neighboring fields would send Martha into episodes of inconsolable weeping. Harold should have been out there among the machines, directing the annual ritual he'd performed for 3 decades. Instead, Martha found herself leasing the farmland to Tom Bradley, unable to bear the thought of working fields that might hold the secret of her husband's fate. The Mitchell family had become prisoners of October 15, 1992, trapped in an endless loop of unanswered questions and unbearable possibilities. They existed in a state of suspended animation, unable to mourn properly because death remained unconfirmed, unable to hope freely because each passing day made Harold's safe return less likely. The farm that had nurtured 3 generations of Mitchells had become a monument to uncertainty, its fields and buildings forever marked by the inexplicable absence of the man who'd loved the land more than his own life. Sheriff Robert Clark's investigation into Harold Mitchell's disappearance officially entered cold case status on April 15, 1993, exactly 6 months after the farmer vanished from his cornfield. The transition was marked not by ceremony, but by the simple act of moving Harold's file from Clark's active case drawer to a storage cabinet in the basement of the Grain County Courthouse. The manila folder, swollen with witness statements, photographs, and evidence logs, joined dozens of other unsolved cases dating back to the 1960s, each representing someone's unanswered prayers and unhealed wounds. The theories about what happened to Harold Mitchell multiplied like prairie grass after spring rain, each one seeming plausible until subjected to careful scrutiny. The accident theory dominated early speculation among Millerville residents, who couldn't accept that deliberate harm had come to someone as universally respected as Harold. They imagined him suffering a heart attack or stroke while checking his crops, stumbling into Willow Creek and being swept downstream during the October flood stage. Search teams dragged the creek for 3 miles downstream from Harold's property, finding rusted farm equipment and the skeleton of a deer, but nothing human. The medical examiner's office in Topeka consulted on the case, explaining that bodies in moving water typically surface within weeks due to decomposition gases, especially in October's moderate temperatures. When no body appeared after 2 months of intensive searching, the accident theory lost credibility among investigators, though it remained popular with community members who preferred natural explanations to the alternatives that haunted their imagination. Financial motivation provided another avenue of speculation. Despite Harold's apparent solvency, Michael Mitchell granted investigators access to his father's bank records, revealing a modest but stable financial picture. Harold owed $23,000 on his farm mortgage, well within acceptable limits given his land's value. His checking account showed regular deposits from grain sales and cattle auctions, with no unusual transactions in the months preceding his disappearance. Insurance investigators examined Harold's life insurance policies, finding no recent changes or increased coverage that might suggest premeditation. The voluntary disappearance theory emerged from outside the community, suggested by Kansas Bureau of Investigation agents who'd worked similar cases involving middle-aged men facing undetected personal crises. They pointed to Harold's mysterious phone call the night before his disappearance and his uncharacteristic questions about his children's schedules as potential evidence of advance planning. This theory particularly tormented Martha, who questioned every conversation she'd had with Harold in his final weeks, searching for signs of deception or desperation she might have missed. Clark pursued the voluntary disappearance angle with methodical thoroughness, checking bus station security footage, interviewing truck stop employees along major highways, and coordinating with law enforcement agencies across the Midwest. The investigation revealed that Harold had withdrawn $200 from his checking account 3 days before disappearing. Not unusual for a farmer needing cash for equipment repairs, but potentially significant for someone planning to start over elsewhere. Yet no witnesses placed Harold at any transportation hubs, and his pickup truck remained the last confirmed sighting of the missing farmer. The foul play theory gained momentum as other explanations proved inadequate. Clark interviewed dozens of Harold's acquaintances, searching for hidden enemies or business disputes that might motivate violence. The investigation revealed Harold's involvement in several property boundary disputes over the years, typical conflicts between neighboring farmers that rarely escalated beyond heated conversations. None of the disputes seemed severe enough to warrant murder, and all parties involved provided solid alibis for October 15th. More disturbing possibilities emerged as Clark expanded his investigation beyond Grain County. 3 other farmers in eastern Kansas had disappeared under mysterious circumstances during the previous decade, though none shared Harold's exact circumstances. A federal task force examining rural crime patterns suggested potential connections to drug trafficking operations that used isolated farmland for methamphetamine production, but searches of Harold's property revealed no evidence of such activity. As months turned to years, the theories became increasingly elaborate and desperate. Some suggested Harold had discovered illegal activities on neighboring properties and been silenced to protect criminal enterprises. Others proposed that Harold had been mistaken for someone else, the victim of a case of mistaken identity that sent him to an unmarked grave. A few persistent voices claimed Harold had been recruited by federal agencies for undercover work, though no government officials would confirm or deny such speculation. Sheriff Clark retired in 1998, taking Harold's case file with him as an unofficial consulting assignment. His successor, Sheriff David Brennan, inherited a cold case that had consumed enormous resources while producing minimal results. The Mitchell family continued their private investigation, hiring private detectives and consulting psychics, chasing leads that invariably led nowhere. Harold Mitchell had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed, leaving behind only questions that seemed to grow more complex with each passing year. Sheriff Amanda Rodriguez arrived in Grain County during the winter of 2018, bringing with her 15 years of experience with the Kansas City Police Department's cold case unit and a master's degree in forensic science that her predecessor would have considered unnecessary for rural law enforcement. At 38, Rodriguez represented a new generation of investigators who understood that modern technology could breathe life into cases that had been considered hopeless just decades earlier. Her first week on the job, she descended into the courthouse basement and began systematically reviewing every unsolved case file dating back to 1960. Harold Mitchell's disappearance drew her attention immediately, not because of its age, but because of the gaps in the original investigation. Sheriff Clark had been thorough by 1992 standards, but Rodriguez recognized opportunities that hadn't existed 26 years earlier. The mysterious phone call from the truck stop payphone could now be traced through cellular tower records and enhanced audio analysis. The bloodhound tracking that ended at Willow Creek could be supplemented with ground-penetrating radar and advanced cadaver dogs trained to detect remains buried for decades. Rodriguez's decision to reopen the Mitchell case met resistance from county commissioners who questioned the expense of investigating a disappearance that most residents had accepted as permanently unsolved. The sheriff argued that new technology made the investment worthwhile, particularly given the emotional closure it might provide to Martha Mitchell, who was now 79 and living in the Millerville nursing home, her mind still sharp, but her body weakened by 26 years of unanswered questions. The first breakthrough came from digital enhancement of the original crime scene photographs. Rodriguez sent Clark's Polaroid images to the FBI's forensic laboratory in Quantico, where computer enhancement revealed details invisible to 1992 technology. Tire tracks near Harold's abandoned truck showed tread patterns consistent with a second vehicle, evidence that suggested Harold hadn't been alone in that cornfield. The enhancement also revealed disturbed soil patterns that hadn't been apparent to investigators using naked-eye observation techniques. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Mitchell property began in March 2018, conducted by a team from Kansas State University's Archaeology Department. The technology could detect subsurface anomalies indicating disturbed earth, buried objects, or density changes that might indicate human remains. Rodriguez watched the radar operators work methodically across acres of farmland, their equipment revealing the hidden geography beneath soil that had been plowed and planted for decades. The radar detected multiple anomalies scattered across Harold's former property, now owned by an agricultural corporation that had purchased the land from Martha's Estate Trust in 2010. Most anomalies proved to be buried fence posts, discarded farm equipment, or natural geological features. But 3 locations showed patterns consistent with deliberately excavated and backfilled areas. Locations that hadn't been disturbed by subsequent farming operations because they lay in the woodlot where Harold had cut firewood each winter. Rodriguez coordinated with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation to bring in cadaver dogs, specifically trained to detect remains that had been buried for extended periods. The dogs, German shepherds named Atlas and Ranger, had assisted in solving dozens of cold cases across the Midwest. Their handler, Detective Sarah Chen, explained that decomposition chemicals could remain detectable in soil for decades under the right conditions, particularly in the clay-rich earth common to Kansas Creek bottoms. The dogs showed intense interest in 2 of the 3 radar anomalies, circling and pawing at specific spots with the focused determination that indicated positive scent detection. Rodriguez marked the locations with orange flags and called for excavation equipment, understanding that she was potentially about to answer questions that had tormented an entire community for more than a quarter-century. News of the renewed investigation spread through Millerville with the speed of prairie wildfire. Michael Mitchell, now 56 and serving as executor of his mother's affairs, drove down from Topeka to witness the excavation. Sarah Mitchell Hoffman, married now with children of her own, took leave from her teaching position to be present for what might finally provide the answers her family had sought for 26 years. The community that had gradually forgotten Harold's disappearance suddenly remembered every detail, every theory, every sleepless night, spent wondering what had happened to one of their own. Sheriff Rodriguez understood that she was excavating more than soil. She was digging into the collective memory and trauma of an entire community that had never fully healed from Harold Mitchell's inexplicable vanishing. The excavation began at dawn on April 3, 2018, under overcast skies that seemed to mirror the solemnity of the occasion. Sheriff Rodriguez had coordinated with the Kansas Bureau of Investigation's forensic anthropology team, ensuring that any remains discovered would be handled with scientific precision and legal admissibility. Dr. Marcus Webb, the state's chief forensic anthropologist, supervised the careful removal of topsoil layer by layer using archaeological techniques that preserved potential evidence while revealing what lay beneath decades of Kansas earth. The first anomaly yielded only the remains of a farm dog, probably buried by Harold himself years before his disappearance. The second location revealed fragments of rusted machinery and broken pottery, debris from the original homestead that had occupied the land in the early 1900s. But the third site, located in a natural depression near Willow Creek, where cottonwood trees provided shade and concealment, held secrets that had been waiting 26 years to surface. 18 inches below ground level, Dr. Webb's careful excavation exposed the first evidence that Harold Mitchell's disappearance had been far from voluntary. Fragments of blue denim fabric, preserved by the clay soil's low oxygen environment, emerged from the earth like pieces of a horrific puzzle. The fabric matched the description of the work clothes Harold had been wearing on October 15, 1992, Wrangler jeans that Martha had bought him for his birthday 3 months before his disappearance. The forensic team worked with painstaking precision, photographing and cataloguing each fragment of evidence before its removal. Bone fragments appeared next, scattered and disarticulated by 26 years of freezing and thawing cycles, but clearly human in origin. Dr. Webb's preliminary examination revealed damage patterns consistent with deliberate dismemberment, suggesting that Harold's death had involved not just murder, but careful concealment of evidence. Michael Mitchell stood at the perimeter of the excavation site, his face pale as he watched strangers unearth his father's remains with scientific detachment. Sarah arrived from Kansas City that afternoon, collapsing into her brother's arms as she confronted the reality that their father's absence had been final all along. The hope that had sustained the Mitchell family for more than 2 decades dissolved in the face of forensic evidence that left no room for alternative explanations. Sheriff Rodriguez discovered additional evidence that transformed the crime scene from a simple murder to something more complex and disturbing. A metal detector revealed Harold's wedding ring buried 3 feet from the main grave site, along with his watch and wallet, personal items that a random killer would likely have taken or left with the body. The deliberate separation and burial of these objects suggested someone who knew Harold personally, someone who understood the significance of these items to his identity and his family. More troubling was the discovery of rope fibers wrapped around bone fragments from Harold's wrists and ankles, indicating that he had been restrained before his death. The rope was nylon, a type commonly used for farm equipment, but not necessarily unique to Harold's property. Forensic analysis would later determine that the rope had been cut with a sharp blade, suggesting planning and preparation rather than a crime of passion. The excavation revealed Harold's skull in a separate location, buried 2 feet deeper than the rest of his remains and showing clear evidence of blunt force trauma. Dr. Webb identified multiple fracture patterns consistent with repeated strikes from a heavy object, likely a farming tool or piece of equipment that would have been readily available on any rural property. The positioning of the skull suggested the killer had taken extra care to ensure Harold's remains wouldn't be accidentally discovered by casual activity on the property. As word of the discovery spread through Millerville, the community faced the disturbing realization that Harold Mitchell's killer had lived among them for 26 years. Someone had attended Harold's memorial service, had offered condolences to Martha, had participated in search efforts while knowing exactly where the missing farmer lay buried. The betrayal cut deeper than the original crime, transforming decades of unresolved grief into a sharper, more focused anger. Sheriff Rodriguez coordinated with the district attorney's office to begin building a criminal case based on the forensic evidence. The challenge was enormous. 26 years had passed, witnesses had died or moved away, and memories had faded or been contaminated by decades of speculation. But modern forensic techniques offered possibilities that hadn't existed in 1992, including DNA analysis, enhanced ballistics testing, and digital reconstruction of crime scenes. The breakthrough that the Mitchell family had prayed for had finally arrived, but it brought with it the devastating confirmation that Harold's disappearance had been neither accident nor voluntary departure. Someone in Greene County had murdered Harold Mitchell with deliberate brutality, then hidden his remains for more than a quarter century while watching his family suffer the torment of not knowing. The question that now haunted Sheriff Rodriguez was whether enough evidence remained to identify and prosecute the killer who had evaded justice for so long. The DNA analysis results arrived at Sheriff Rodriguez's office on a humid Tuesday morning in June 2018, carried in a manila envelope that would shatter everything the Mitchell family thought they knew about Harold's death. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic geneticist from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, had extracted DNA samples from bone marrow preserved in Harold's remains and compared them against profiles in the national database. But it wasn't the victim identification that stunned Rodriguez. It was the secondary DNA profile found on rope fibers that had bound Harold's hands, a profile that matched someone already in the system. The name on the laboratory report made Rodriguez read the results 3 times before accepting their accuracy. Thomas Bradley, age 74, Harold's closest neighbor, and the man who had discovered his abandoned truck 26 years earlier. Tom Bradley, who had organized search parties and comforted Martha during her darkest hours. Tom Bradley, who had been present at every major development in the investigation, who had leased Harold's farmland after the disappearance, who had attended Harold's memorial service with tears in his eyes. Rodriguez immediately pulled Tom's file from the original investigation, studying Sheriff Clark's interview notes with new understanding. Tom had claimed to spot Harold's truck at 9:47 a.m. while working on fence posts, but cellular tower records from 1992 showed no calls from Tom's property until 10:15 a.m., 28 minutes after he claimed to have made the discovery. The discrepancy had seemed insignificant in 1992, explained away as confusion during a traumatic event. Now it suggested something far more sinister. The forensic evidence painted a horrifying picture of premeditation and betrayal. Soil analysis revealed that Harold's grave had been prepared weeks before his death, excavated during the September drought, when the hard clay would have been easier to dig. Tom Bradley's property shared a border with the burial site, accessible through a gate that connected their two farms, a gate Tom had installed himself in 1987 under the pretense of easier cattle management between their adjoining pastures. Additional DNA evidence emerged from Harold's recovered clothing, including skin cells under his fingernails that matched Tom Bradley's genetic profile. The forensic pathologist determined that Harold had fought desperately for his life, clawing at his attacker with enough force to leave permanent evidence beneath his nails. The rope used to bind Harold had been cut with pruning shears found in Tom's barn, tools that showed microscopic metal fragments matching the cuts on the recovered fibers. The motive gradually emerged from financial records that hadn't existed in 1992's paper-based banking system. Computer analysis revealed that Tom Bradley had been facing catastrophic debt, with 3 separate bank loans in default and foreclosure proceedings initiated against his property in September 1992. Harold Mitchell had unknowingly stood between Tom and financial salvation. Harold's land contained a natural gas deposit that geological surveys had identified in 1991. Information that Tom had learned through his cousin who worked for the surveying company. The mysterious phone call on October 14th had come from Tom Bradley, who had driven to the interstate truck stop to avoid using his home phone for conversations that might later be traced. Phone records showed Tom had called Harold at 9:23 p.m., speaking for 14 minutes about a fabricated emergency involving cattle that had supposedly broken through their shared fence line. Tom had convinced Harold to meet him early the next morning to assess the damage, knowing Harold's predictable nature would ensure his compliance. Sheriff Rodriguez reconstructed the crime with chilling precision. Tom had ambushed Harold in the cornfield, using a tire iron to inflict the fatal head wounds before transporting his neighbor's body to the pre-prepared grave site. Tom had then driven Harold's truck back to the field and staged the abandonment scene, leaving the engine running and the coffee still warm to suggest a recent departure. The cattle found in the wrong pasture had been moved deliberately to support Tom's cover story about fence line problems. The most devastating revelation came from reviewing Tom's behavior during the original investigation. Not only had he participated in search efforts, but he had actively misdirected them. Tom had suggested focusing searches on areas downstream from Willow Creek, knowing Harold's body lay in the opposite direction. He had volunteered to coordinate with neighboring counties, ensuring he could control information flow and prevent discoveries that might lead back to his property. Michael and Sarah Mitchell learned the truth during a private meeting with Sheriff Rodriguez and District Attorney Rebecca Chen. The siblings sat in stunned silence as Rodriguez explained how their father's trusted neighbor and friend had murdered him for money, then spent 26 years comforting their family while Harold's bones lay buried just beyond their property line. Sarah vomited in the courthouse restroom afterward, her body rejecting the reality that someone she had called Uncle Tom throughout her childhood had been her father's killer. The betrayal cut deeper than the original crime. Tom Bradley had attended every family gathering for years after Harold's disappearance, had hugged Martha at church services, had offered to help with farm chores when she needed assistance. He had looked Michael and Sarah in the eyes countless times, expressing sympathy for their loss, while knowing exactly how their father had died and where his remains were hidden. The community of Millerville reeled from the revelation that Harold Mitchell's killer had been hiding in plain sight for more than 2 decades. Trust, the foundation of small-town life, crumbled as residents questioned every interaction they'd had with Tom Bradley, every kindness he'd shown, every tear he'd shed for Harold's family. The man they'd known as a pillar of the community had been revealed as something monstrous, a predator who had worn the mask of friendship while harboring the darkest of secrets. The arrest of Thomas Bradley occurred at dawn on June 28, 2018, precisely 26 years, 8 months, and 13 days after Harold Mitchell's murder. Sheriff Rodriguez had coordinated the operation with tactical precision, surrounding Tom's farmhouse with deputies and Kansas Bureau of Investigation agents while the 74-year-old suspect performed his morning chores. Tom was feeding cattle in his barn when Rodriguez approached him. The irony, not lost on anyone present, that he was captured while caring for the same animals he had used as an excuse to lure Harold to his death. Tom Bradley offered no resistance when Rodriguez read him his rights, his weathered face showing neither surprise nor remorse as the handcuffs closed around his wrists. The man who had spent decades playing the role of grieving neighbor simply nodded when informed of the charges against him. First-degree murder, conspiracy, and desecration of a corpse. His only words during the arrest were a request to call his daughter in California, a conversation that would shatter another family's understanding of the man they thought they knew. The booking photo showed a face that Millerville residents struggled to reconcile with their memories. Tom Bradley, the man who had organized church potlucks and helped elderly neighbors with snow removal, stared into the camera with eyes that revealed nothing of the thoughts behind them. The mugshot would later become the image that defined him, replacing decades of community photographs that showed him smiling beside Harold at county fairs and harvest celebrations. News of the arrest spread through Grain County with the speed of a summer storm, reaching every household before the morning newspapers could print the story. The Millerville Diner became an impromptu gathering place where residents tried to process the unthinkable reality that a trusted community member had committed the crime that had haunted them for 26 years. Conversations that began with disbelief gradually turned to anger as people remembered specific instances of Tom's deception. His participation in search efforts, his comfort of Martha during her grief, his acquisition of Harold's farmland at below-market prices. The legal proceedings moved with deliberate care, District Attorney Rebecca Chen understanding that the case would be scrutinized for any procedural errors that might allow Tom Bradley to escape justice. The forensic evidence was overwhelming, but Chen faced the challenge of proving premeditation and motive to a jury that might struggle to accept that someone they'd known for decades was capable of such calculated evil. The DNA evidence was irrefutable, but the emotional component of the case required careful handling to ensure justice rather than vengeance. Tom Bradley's public defender, appointed by the court when he claimed inability to afford private counsel, faced an impossible task. The evidence against his client was scientifically unassailable, and Tom's presence at every significant moment of the original investigation suggested consciousness of guilt rather than innocent cooperation. The defense strategy focused on Tom's age and declining health, arguing for mercy rather than denial of culpability. Martha Mitchell died in her sleep on August 15, 2018, 3 weeks before Tom Bradley's trial was scheduled to begin. She was 80 years old, her body finally surrendering to the accumulated weight of 26 years of unanswered questions. Michael and Sarah believed their mother had held on long enough to learn the truth about Harold's fate, but couldn't endure witnessing his killer's trial. Martha was buried beside the empty grave that had been prepared for Harold in 1992, their headstones finally reunited after more than 2 decades of separation. The trial began on September 10, 2018, in the Greene County Courthouse, where Harold's case file had gathered dust for so many years. Judge Patricia Morrison presided over proceedings that attracted media attention from across Kansas and neighboring states. The small courtroom overflowed with spectators, many of whom had known both victim and perpetrator for decades. Tom Bradley sat silent throughout the testimony, showing no emotion, as expert witnesses described how he had murdered his neighbor and hidden the crime for 26 years. Dr. Webb testified about the forensic evidence with clinical precision, explaining how the bone fragments told the story of Harold's violent death and deliberate concealment. DNA experts described the genetic material that linked Tom Bradley to the crime with statistical certainty. Sheriff Rodriguez walked the jury through the investigation that had finally brought Harold home, her voice steady as she described the moment his remains were discovered in the shadow of his killer's property. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all charges. Tom Bradley, now 75 years old, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a punishment that ensured he would die behind bars as Harold had died in the Kansas earth. As the sentence was read, Tom finally showed emotion, tears streaming down his face as he faced the reality that his decades of deception had finally ended. Michael and Sarah Mitchell stood outside the courthouse after the sentencing, addressing reporters who had covered their family's long journey from uncertainty to painful truth. They spoke of relief that their father's killer would face justice, but also of the irreplaceable years stolen from their family by Tom Bradley's greed and cruelty. The Mitchell siblings asked that their father be remembered not for the way he died, but for the way he lived, as a man who trusted his neighbors and loved his family, virtues that made him vulnerable to the evil that lurked behind a familiar face. Harold Mitchell was finally laid to rest on October 15, 2018, exactly 26 years after his disappearance. The funeral that had been impossible in 1992 finally took place, attended by hundreds of community members who came to honor a man whose death had taught them that true evil often wears the mask of friendship. His headstone bore the dates of his birth and death, separated by 54 years of life that ended in betrayal, but would be remembered for its goodness. If this story has moved you, if it's made you think about the people in your own community and the secrets they might be hiding, then subscribe to our channel where we explore more cold cases that have finally found resolution. Share your thoughts about the Harold Mitchell case in the comments below. What signs do you think the community might have missed? How do you think you would react if someone you trusted for decades was revealed to be a killer? These questions matter, because cases like Harold's remind us that justice, no matter how delayed, is always worth pursuing.